Let's make a 100% historically inaccurate quilted petticoat. Sometimes I research what I'm about to do, and sometimes I do not. So this is like a middle ground. I'm looking at one blog post about quilted petticoats, and then I'm just gonna get going because I've put this project off long enough. I've done like other little projects instead of doing this one, and now I'm just like, you know what? Clearly, I just need to jump into this, and it will be what it will be. This blog post says that quilted petticoats were made out of like satins, silk thread, and the cheaper versions were made out of woolen fabrics and simple quilting designs. And you know what? I'm gonna go with the cheaper option because I don't have silks and fancy wools. I have bed sheets and some quilt batting, and I think that's gonna work just fine for our purposes. Also, no one can tell me what to do, so I'm just going to probably wing it until the very, very end. Oh, that's nice. Okay, the really pretty ones are probably out of my skill set for right now. That doesn't mean they'll always be out of my skill set, but for now we're gonna go with something more simple, like this one, but longer, just a little bit longer. And I've never done this before, nor have I ever like machine quilted anything, so this is all very much an experiment. What better way to start an experiment than with another experiment? So I have my quilt batting sandwiched in between two pieces of the fabric I plan to use, and it turns out that the free motion quilting foot that I bought on Amazon works just fine on my machine, so I guess we are ready to go. So I grab my fabric, which again is literally just bed sheets from Walmart. And I guess now is a good time to mention that both of these sheets are the fitted sheets because I've already used the flat sheets on other projects. Also, because these bed sheets have been sitting in my basement for like 6 years now, I really needed to iron them out before I could actually use them and cut them into the right shape. Next up was cutting out the dusty, crusty quilt batting that I also got in my basement that's also been down there for a long time. Honestly, the only part of this project that is historically accurate is the dust that collected on my materials. I kind of eyeballed the trapezoid shape for the skirt, and I cut it a little bit bigger than what I needed. Then I layered everything together and pinned it all in place with safety pins in preparation for the quilting process. Friendly reminder that I've never quilted anything before, and so I really had no idea what I was doing. I used the edge of this cookie tin lid to draw scallops on the hem of the petticoat. I guess I felt like challenging myself because doing a straight hem would have been a million times easier. I must have just been feeling really optimistic at this point because it wasn't so hard yet. I knew I wanted to incorporate snowflakes into the design because I'm planning on wearing this petticoat with an Elsa dress that I haven't made yet. So I made a quick template and then traced the designs onto the fabric. And then I free motion quilted each snowflake. The first few snowflakes were not pretty. The lines I drew were really hard to see, and it's not easy to push and manipulate the bulky material through the machine. On top of that, it's really difficult to keep your stitch lengths even. I really should have done more practice before working on the final petticoat, but this petticoat is for practice, so I can't feel too bad about having a few uggo snowflakes. Plus, all the ugly ones are on the back, so that's fine. After the first few abominations, I got the hang of using the free motion quilting foot, and my lines, stitches, and overall neatness started to improve. Pro tip: load a bunch of bobbins before you start a quilting project because I was absolutely burning through bobbins, just munching them up. And now a moment to appreciate my efforts. So lovely. Moving on to the next bit, I quilted an additional scallop on top of each snowflake, and I also switched back to the blue top stitching thread so that only the snowflakes are quilted in white. I followed the scallop design 2 more times to add more quilting to the petticoat. Then I drew a straight line across the top of my existing quilting and quilted down a few more lines. I wanted there to be some separation between the more intricate hem design and the less interesting design I had planned for the top portion of the petticoat. Then it was time to start quilting down the bulk of the skirt. I layered down 2 gigantic measuring sticks and drew multiple diagonal guidelines, each one parallel to the other, and then sat at my sewing machine for an hour, sewing nothing but straight, even lines, letting my brain turn almost completely off as I experienced the absolute bliss of doing a near thoughtless task. The most difficult thing about sewing this part of the petticoat was just managing the bulk that accumulated in between the neck of my sewing machine and the needle. So I just rolled it up and shoved it through the best that I could. And so the first round of straight lines was completed with relative ease, and I was ready to start the second round. I used the exact same method as before. Draw on the lines and then mindlessly quilt them on, managing the bulk of the skirt to the best of my abilities. And it started looking like a puffy sleeping bag, and that let me know that I was very much heading down the right path. Because what is a quilted petticoat if not a wearable skirt-like, publicly appropriate, semi-puffy blanket/sleeping bag that keeps you warm during the cold winter months? After after successfully procrastinating all morning, I did laundry, I cleaned my kitchen, I ran a whole bunch of errands. I also finally finished the front panel.
I 100% meant to say the back panel. The back panel is finished.
The petticoat. And I don't feel like it has to be perfect, but yeah, no, it could definitely be uglier. So this is a win. We're gonna take it for what it is. And I think I'm gonna start working on the front panel, which is the part that I think you'll see more than the back panel, and that's why I started with the back one, because like all the ugly stuff's gonna go on the back, all the nice stuff's gonna go on the front. Hopefully. I mean, that may not be the case. It might just be ugly no matter what I do, but I'm gonna finish this and we're gonna see what happens.
And so I started the entire process again, because I originally did not trust my non-existent quilting skills enough to sew both the front and back panels at the same time. I didn't want to put a ton of hours into it only for everything to go horribly wrong, so I decided to just work one at a time. And ultimately, I think that was a good choice, as it helped me to feel not so overwhelmed with learning and kind of making up so many new skills and design choices. The only major difference between the front and the back panel is that the front panel is a bit smaller, as in it's not as wide, and then the snowflakes are substantially better quality. I definitely figured out how to use the free motion quilting foot better, and I stuck to just 2 snowflake designs instead of making each one different like I did on the back. And now that I've unlocked this new quilting skill set, I just might make a puffy jacket or something next, because it's really satisfying to do and I love the way the end result looks.
I could stop here and just be done, and just assemble the 2 pieces together, pleat them, do all the finishing work, but I think that it's gonna be too bulky. Like, I think I need to add twice as many diagonal lines onto each, this one and that one, each front and back, because I'm nervous that if I try to put it underneath the dress that I'm planning on wearing it with, which is the Elsa Olaf's Frozen Adventure dress, that it's just gonna be too bulky and it's gonna look ridiculous. And I would rather almost have it be flatter and less puffy just for that reason alone. So I think I'm gonna go through and just do twice as many diagonal lines and see what it looks like. I mean, worst case scenario, I have more diamonds, right? Like, I'm not gonna ruin it, hopefully. I just look at how flat these are and they're like closer together in comparison to how puffy this is up here, and I think this is better for the body and the bulk of the skirt, just because I'm planning on wearing it underneath something that doesn't really need a lot of volume. I've drawn a couple of them in and just making the diamonds smaller because it's a little puffy right now, but for the most part I think it looks okay. Considering that this was the first time I've ever done anything like this, it could definitely be uglier.
As someone who has made a lot of ugly things, I'm really happy that this isn't ugly, because the creative process isn't always rhinestones and amazing reveals. Sometimes it's a nasty dumpster fire and the only way out is to quit and never make anything fun again. No, that's not true, but design and pattern making are not always easy things to do. But do you know what is an easy thing to do? Loading a bunch of bobbins before you start a project. I kept running out of thread, and I just kept using the same bobbin over and over and over instead of loading like, I don't know, 10 bobbins full of thread. I probably needed 10 bobbins full of thread, but no! I just kept using the one! Now that I added the additional quilting lines, it's time to trim up the bottom scallops of the skirt and then make a bunch of bias binding to go around the petticoat. I do this by cutting many 2-inch wide strips of fabric and then sewing them together diagonally into one giant long tapeworm of fabric. Then I pull the big long fabric tapeworm through this little binding bell tool and iron it flat. I actually really love making bias binding. It is one of the most satisfying parts about sewing. It's just such a smooth process, and I get to watch a movie the entire time, so that's great.
I have all my bias tape ready to go. It's like all wrapped up on this piece of Amazon box that I cut off of earlier, and it's like the double fold kind, so you can kind of see like if it catches the light. And I'm just gonna like put that on the edge of my quilted petticoat, and that's gonna seal everything in.
For the first round of bias binding, I just sandwich the bias tape around the bulky sides of the petticoat and then pin it in place, making sure that everything is secured and pinned into the bias binding. Then I sew all the way around the sides and the bottom hem of the skirt. And then I run out of bobbin thread, and I use a second method for binding the front panel of the skirt. This time I opened up the bias binding and stitched the bias tape to the front of the skirt, and then folded it around the back and hand stitched the bias tape. In my opinion, this is definitely the prettier method for sewing on bias binding, but it takes much longer, and for this project I really don't think it was necessary, but I'm glad I utilized both methods. And now we are in the home stretch of this project. It's time to sew the front and back panels together. I stopped sewing about 8 inches from the top to leave a gap on both sides, and then I sewed on more bias binding to the top border of the skirt. Then, I pleated down the front and back panels until it fit my body the way I wanted to. It took some time and I tried a few different kinds and different sizes of pleats before settling on what we have here. I stitched the pleats down to make sure that they were as secure and flat as possible. The pleats add more bulk to an already bulky petticoat, but by stitching them down on both sides of the pleats, it really helps to reduce the volume. I wanted to make the skirt close without installing a zipper, so I punched a grommet hole in each corner of the top of the skirt and installed 4 metal grommets, using a bit of E6000 glue in between the grommets for an extra strong hold. I then made 2 ties with the leftover bias tape. And now I will wrestle not just the skirt, but the dress form as well in an attempt to show you how I tie up the skirt. It's really easy, you just loop the ties through the grommets and tie the back and the front and the front and the back. This is an 18th century method of tying a skirt. That does not make this petticoat an 18th century petticoat, just by the way. I mean, historical accuracy is a myth anyways, so I'm just gonna do whatever I want. So here is a detailed shot of the pleats, as well as a detailed shot of the body of the petticoat. This is what some people in the industry refer to as a bulky boy, a chunky chunker, a thick, no, thoughts on this, feelings on this. What am I thinking? What am I feeling? It took longer than I expected it to, as per usual. It's very warm, I will say that. Like, I stayed pretty warm while we were out taking pictures. We were only outside for like 5 minutes though, so maybe I need to test it a little bit more. I've also read that if you wash it, like throw it in the washing machine and then dry it, it kind of like gets more quilty, so maybe it like will not be as puffy. My concern about this is when I put it underneath the dress that I'm planning on making, it might be too bulky. I might not actually end up wearing it for what I want to wear it for, which is not a big deal. I still want to make a matching corset or stays to go with it because I think it's really cute. My favorite part about it is definitely the diamond pattern quilting on it. I'm really proud about how some of the snowflakes turned out. This is a nice one. Some of them are not as nice, but you gotta start somewhere when you're learning, right? That's the whole point. Yeah, this ate up a good chunk of my time. In a good way. If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like and subscribe. New videos are on their way soon. And in this house, we craft in pajamas.